All right, can everybody in the back come on in and find your seats? All right, I want to welcome everybody to Demos today for what I think will be a really interesting, timely, and provocative conversation. My name is Miles Rapoport. I'm the president of Demos. And about a month ago or so, a friend called me, and we ended up in a conversation about what happened to the movement. Here we are in a situation where inequality is at levels not seen since 1913, when the federal income tax was enacted. Unemployment is at 9.1%, 3 years after the recession is supposedly over. The banks are back to doing business exactly as they did business before the crash. Seemingly serious political candidates are saying what we need is more deregulation and financial innovation. But where's the outrage? Why isn't it people are not in the streets? And then shortly after that, my old friend Michael Kazin had a piece in the New York Times which sort of raised the same question based on a long reading of history of progressive movements and left-wing movements in America. So I think that we're here to have some discussion about that. Let me just sort of give a couple of perspectives to start off. First of all, where is the movement and why aren't people in the streets are actually two different questions. They're closely related, but they're not the same. Because I think what happens is the question becomes, why aren't people in the streets has now sort of been answered. There really are in hundreds, maybe thousands of places around the United States. Occupy Wall Street has become Occupy San Francisco and Occupy Dubuque and Occupy Mystic, Connecticut. There were 20 people occupying the center of Mystic, Connecticut last Saturday, so I was very impressed with this. But on the other hand, that's not all it takes to build a movement. What does it take to build a movement? And there are a lot of things, and I think we actually lose, those of us who are progressives, when we try to argue about which is the most important piece of a movement, because there are lots of pieces to it. It obviously, let me just say, outline just a couple of them that they seem to me to be relevant, and maybe we'll have some conversation about this going forward. We obviously need the conditions that require change, whether it's segregation in the South or the relegation of women to second-class citizenship, oppression based on sexual identity, the absence of voting rights going way back to the women's suffrage movement. You need conditions that require it. But you also need a lot of different things that will make the world change. One is, I do think you need a set of ideas, which is books and reports and perspectives and policy manuals and pieces of legislation. And that's actually where Demos comes in. We think of ourselves as a progressive policy center or a think tank. We put out books, we put out reports, we try to get people on the op-ed pages of mainstream magazines. We actually now publish a magazine, The American Prospect, which is part, and seems to me, of creating a progressive narrative in America. So you need people who are working on that ideas level. You need political leaders. I think sometimes you can denigrate politicians in an all-encompassing way that I think it cannot be helpful. We need people who are willing to get into that arena. Think about Elizabeth Warren for a minute, who are going to have the courage of convictions and be willing to fight that fight. We need organizers and organizations, the kinds of organizers and organizations that Michael Kazin has written about in the book. The people who are going to day in, day out work to build things, at times when there is a spark and at times when there isn't a spark, to try to make the country more ready and have organizations that can move an agenda, run campaigns, ask for legislation, put pressure on people who are in political office. And then you also need a spark. Whether it was the Vietnam War and the college campuses, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's the Stonewall riot, something has to happen to move people into action. And I think a lot of those conditions are now here and really interesting to talk about. And we'll have some real conversation about this today with three people that I think know some of where they speak. So let me introduce them in reverse order from which you'll hear from them. Rakim Brooks, who's a C. Edwin Baker Fellow in Democratic Practice here at Demos. Rakim is a rising public intellectual, someone you'll be reading about, hearing about for a long time in the future. He writes about U.S. politics and political ideologies, America's progressive movement. He was a John Kenneth Galbraith Scholar at Harvard University, was named a Rhodes Scholar, received his MPhil in politics from Oxford University, and is a regular contributor to Demos' own policyshop.net. We also have, excuse me, Kelly Heresy. Now, I have to admit, when I saw Kelly Heresy's name, I said, that's too precious. That is not his real name. And in fact, it's not. Sorry. But it is his internet name. His real name is Kelly Hanlon. He writes under the name of Kelly Heresy. He is originally from Pennsylvania, but now in New York. He's a music producer, an organizer, and has been part of Occupy Wall Street from the very, very beginning. He's also going to be writing for a new webzine called Newtopia, which I said I would give a plug for, and so keep an eye out for that. So we're going to hear from Kelly. And lastly, we're going to hear from Mike Kazin. Michael Kazin is a distinguished author. He's a professor of history at Georgetown University. He's written a number of books and is considered the leading kind of expert on populism. He's written about William Jennings Bryan, about the labor barons of the 19th century, and numerous other books. His new book, which is the trigger for today's event, is American Dreamers: How the Left Changed the Nation. I think it's a great read. It's here for purchase. He's also written an article in Dissent magazine, which is here at the front desk, and we have some people from Dissent here as our co-sponsors. Thank you very much. But before I introduce Mike, I do want to say, tell a little story, and that is when I was 17 years old, I arrived at college campus, and at that time was the middle of the Vietnam War. I was ripe and ready to become an activist. And on the third day I was in campus, I got a leaflet under my door that said, if you're interested in joining Students for a Democratic Society, contact Michael Kazin. So I did. He managed in about an hour and a half to recruit me. I was an easy mark to SDS, and we have been activists, friends, and partners in crime in one way or another for 44 years since then. So it's, I was trying to think, what's the absolute opposite of alienated labor? And I was trying to think of what the scientific term is, but I can only really come up with it, a labor of love. So I consider it a labor of love and friendship to introduce Michael Kazin, the author of American Dreamers: How the Left Changed the Nation. Michael?
Thanks a lot, Miles. 44 years. It's a real honor to be here. Demos is exactly the kind of institution we need many more of. Though if we had many more, you'd have to fight them for fundraising, I guess. But you know, one of the things which progressives, of course, have lacked, or lacked at least up until the year 2000 or so, were institutions to do a really, honest job of doing what institutions like the AEI and the Heritage Foundation sometimes do a not quite as honest a job, I would argue. That is to really, reveal what's going on in American society, to study it, to help to promote young people like Rakim and others to do more of that, really to train the next generation of people who are going to change America, and for that matter, change the world, because of course America's no longer just America. So it's a real honor to be here. This is exactly the kind of audience that I wrote the book for, though of course if people on the right want to read it too, I'm very happy. I'm a historian, and many of you have taken history classes in college. And you know that, if you tell a historian, you allow a historian to talk about a book he wrote, which begins in the 1820s and goes up to Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009, you better settle in for a long time. But I'm not going to be that kind of historian today, because I really want us to have a good dialogue here, a good discussion here. I'm thrilled that Kelly's here, and we can talk about what's going on now, as well as talk about what went on in the past. So I just want to talk about the highlights of what I've tried to do in this book. And then Kelly will talk, and then we'll have Rakim will help us have more of a dialogue between ourselves and with everybody else. So that's really the most interesting thing I think we can do today. But before that, it's always nice to start with a song. So cue it, please.
They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower to the sun, brick, mortar, and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee doodle-de-dum. 500,000 boots went marching through hell, and I was a kid with a drum. Hey, don't you remember, they called me Al. It was Al all the time.
Who was that? Very good, Al Jolson, exactly. He did a lot of things besides the jazz singer. Well, I played that song a couple of reasons. First of all, it's 80 years since it was written in 1931, in the middle of the worst depression in American history, now in the middle of a very serious economic crisis, though not yet a depression, but probably the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. It's still a powerful piece of music. A beggar, in the lyric, the beggar talks back to the system that stole his livelihood, that mocks his patriotism. And it's very clear from this lyric, written by Yip Harburg, that Al is every man. He was once a farmer, construction worker, a soldier in World War I. He's seeking a handout, but you can tell in Al Jolson's voice, this is not justified. He's not someone coming to you, please give me a little bit of money. The system has failed him. And he wants to know why, in effect. Why someone who built up the country has this system failed? Well, despite the, I want to play that partly because I think it still resonates. There are a lot of people out there who, Iraq and Afghan war veterans who can't find jobs. A lot of people out there who did a lot to build up this country and now no longer have a job to do that. But also because it makes a point that it helps to make a point that I make in the book, which is that in many ways the cultural work of the left, and here I mean primarily the radical left. We can talk about the relationship between the radical left and the more reformist left, which of course Demos represents, the American Prospect represents, and how even what those terms mean, if they're even useful or not. But one of the things that's very important, I think, in American history is that the left, even though it hasn't had a tremendous amount of success politically, unlike in Europe, we've had no large and durable socialist parties or communist parties or labor parties, and even the most left-wing political candidates running as Democrats, like George McGovern, didn't do very well. Many people look back to Franklin Roosevelt's 1936 campaign as being the last time when there was really a sort of left liberal candidate who was successful in American politics, though in 1964 Lyndon Johnson would come close. But I think in many ways the left has helped to change what I call the moral sense of society, a sense of what's right and wrong in society, and also a sense of how we remember history in many ways. For example, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? A lyric written by a radical named Yip Harburg, who was close to the Communist Party when he wrote it, set to a Russian Jewish lullaby, by the way. This is just one of the cultural documents that was created by leftists that continued to dominate the way we understand the Great Depression. I mean, think about when you images in your mind of the Great Depression, and this is true for most Americans, I think. What do you think about? Well, of course, you think about Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats and his first inaugural, nothing to fear but fear itself, even though that was a very clever way to say something which everyone knew wasn't really true. There was a lot to fear besides fear in 1933. But besides that, think of the image of Dorothea Lange's migrant mother. This woman who reflects while she suffers, kind of hinting that poverty can ennoble you if you bear no responsibility for your plight. Think of Grapes of Wrath, that great narrative about Dust Bowl refugees who learned to fight back against their bosses. Think of Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl ballads, and of course, This Land Is Your Land. Think of Mrs. Smith Goes to Washington, Frank Capra's great film from 1939 that exposes the corruption, the venality in Congress at that time. Every single one of these artists was associated with the left, with specifically a group called the Popular Front, which was a vigorously democratic and multiracial movement originally spawned by the Communist Party, which itself was a completely undemocratic party, which was enthralled to one of the most vicious, brutal, undemocratic regimes of modern history. So history is full of contradictions, as you know. But it's important, I think, that we think of the Great Depression through the eyes of people like Dorothea Lange, through the music of people like Yip Harburg, through the scripts of people like Sidney Buckman, who was the scriptwriter for Mrs. Smith Goes to Washington, and at the time he wrote the script, was a member of the Communist Party. For that matter, John Steinbeck did research for Grapes of Wrath when he was active with a group called, a union called UKAPAWA, which is a long acronym for the Union of Packing House and Agricultural Workers in California, which was also led by radicals. So the paradox here is that the cultural influence of the left has not been matched by its political influence, by its electoral influence especially. The communists are the best example of that. I would argue people who were partly inspired by this movement that the Communist Party spawned on the cultural front was a dismal failure politically. Communists elected just 2 officials in the United States, both of whom were councilmen from New York City. And this is, even though there was a wide gulf between the political influence of the left historically and the cultural influence of the left in the 30s, it's not a paradox limited to the 1930s, I don't think. Another example, think of what I call the anti-monopoly movement of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a movement which included socialists, populists, temperance workers as well, women suffragists, and of course, labor unionists, and also middle-class progressives like Jane Addams. This movement did a whole lot to pave the way for the regulation of big business, for the passage of the Income Tax Amendment, for the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. Really was the maker of what we now think as the progressive era which leading conservative Republicans today would like to repeal, pretty much all of. Who started, who inspired this anti-monopoly movement? Well, there are various ways to look at it. Nothing in history is simple, but I would argue that it was, in part, radical authors, pamphleteers, novelists. 2 in particular: Henry George, the author of the most popular economics book of the 19th century, far outselling anything Marx wrote, by the way, called Progress and Poverty, and Edward Bellamy, the author of what is now a kind of a cranky novel, utopian novel, called Looking Backward, but was a huge bestseller both in the United States and all over the world after it was published in 1888. Both these figures, if you've read their books or heard about them, really got people to think in utopian ways, is the best way to put it. It got people to think about how society could be different, how the growing concentration of industry, the growing influence of big money, corporate influence in American politics didn't have to be that way. That small business people, small farmers, industrial workers, middle-class reformers of various kinds could push back against that power. It took, as Miles was saying, it took ideas. It took a different vision. It took a different idea of how America could operate. And figures like Bellamy and like George, and there were others, but these were two particularly prominent and popular ones at the late 19th century, really, I think, began a process of pushing political figures like Theodore Roosevelt, like Woodrow Wilson, like Robert La Follette, to make some of the changes that we still, at least those of us who identify with the progressive movement and progressive legacy, still defend and are trying to build on. One more example. Think of the New Left that I joined when I was still in high school, and recruited some very skillful, clever people to be part of. I didn't remember I recruited you. So, that shows my memory is going here. Or else I feel like Miles and I have been sort of brothers for so long in progressive politics. I don't remember who influenced who. The New Left, I think, did a lot of good for American society. We can debate that. But most of the good we did was the kind of things that we said, the kind of visions that we put forth, the kind of critiques we made of racial inequality, of military intervention in the poor nations of the Third World. I shouldn't say we, but women associated with the New Left did a lot to create a new feminist movement. Gay men and women did a lot came out of the New Left, did a lot to create really the first mass movement for homosexual rights in human history, which, if you think about it, is a remarkable development historically. 10,000 years of human history, and in the last 40 years, gay men and lesbians have achieved something that gay men and lesbians in the rest of human history didn't even think of achieving. Now, the New Left politically was, let me not put too fine a point on this, pretty much a total failure. Some of us attempted to form third parties. Peace and Freedom Party in California, for example, which is still around, and a party which many of you probably haven't even heard of. How many people have ever heard of the Citizens Party? Aha, yes, some historians there. Citizens Party was an attempt in 1980 to put together all the various fragments of the New Left, and many of them were really fragments by 1980. The women's movement, the Native American movement, the African American movement, the environmental movement, women's movement, and so forth, into a new, what they hope to be a new third party. It was pretty well funded. It had some prominent people associated with it, and the candidate was very well known, Barry Commoner for president. Barry Commoner, the famous ecologist who had gotten himself on the cover of Time magazine at the time of the first Earth Day. He was a well-known figure and sold lots of books. The Citizens Party, which I voted for in 1980, got the grand total of 250,000 votes. And even in Berkeley, California, one of the bastions of the left by any definition in America, Ronald Reagan outvoted Barry Commoner in Berkeley, California. The same Ronald Reagan who, in 1966, when he ran for governor in California, spent a lot of time denouncing the troubles of Berkeley. So this was not a great success. But in cultural terms, I think the New Left continues actually to be a force, and not just people from the New Left, but people, children of people in the New Left. Just a couple examples. I mean, think of Hollywood films, you've seen in recent days. Think about how corporations are treated by Hollywood. Think of George Clooney's films about, Syriana and films Michael Mann has made about the tobacco industry and so forth. It's not as if there'd never been a New Left, these kind of really sharp and very successful at the box office anti-corporate films wouldn't still have been made, but the ideas that generated those films came in many cases from people who had been active in the 1960s. Think of an example which is ambiguous in some ways, but still very powerful. Think of The Simpsons. Simpsons was created by Matt Groening. He's still kind of associated with it. Matt Groening was a radical hippie in the early 1970s. He went to a college called Western Washington State College in Bellingham, Washington. And if you look at his cartoons during the 1970s, they are radical cartoons. And if you look at some of his cartoons collected in Life is Hell, that series, that's there too. And The Simpsons itself, if you think about it, especially in its first 5 to 10 years of life, was almost a sort of vulgar Marxist wet dream. I mean, it's amazing if you think about, Mr. Burns. You can't imagine a more vulgar depiction of a capitalist, than Mr. Burns. And of course, you have a corrupt, fast-talking Kennedy-esque politician, though he doesn't have Kennedy's politics. He just has his accent, and on and on and on. So in many ways, The Simpsons, too, is an example, somewhat diluted, obviously, of the impact, I think, of the New Left on American culture. So, to summarize, I think leftists, and I, of course, can go into great detail about other movements and other times in the question period, but my argument in this book is that the left in America has changed America primarily, not only, but primarily by putting forth ideas, bold visions of a different future, bold American dreams, I would argue, because the left is never as successful, I think, in American history as when it speaks in an American idiom, as when it quotes the Declaration of Independence, when it talks in terms of American ideals, which are being betrayed by people in power. And also when many times it makes its peace with religion, realizes that whether one believes in a greater being or not, in the end, it's what you do with that belief, how you apply your Christianity, your Judaism, your Islam, your Buddhism, your Jainism, whatever, to worldly affairs that should matter, and to other people that should matter. And leading figures in American history, in the American left, Martin Luther King Jr., Edward Bellamy, and others have been, I think, absolutely crucial to achieving what the left has achieved. And they were, of course, religious people. Edward Bellamy talked about his utopia as being a religion of solidarity. Anything else I want to put out there? Yeah, I think that one important thing, and this is sobering perhaps for people to contemplate, is that when at least the radical left was most successful, it was at a time when before being on the left began to be associated with tyrannical governments, the Soviet Union primarily. It was a time also when the left was able not just to make its peace with religion, but include a lot of ministers, Protestant, some Catholic priests, rabbis, in its purview. For example, the Socialist Party from roughly 1902 to World War I was strong in places like Oklahoma, Nevada. They had encampments on the prairies, on the Great Plains, in which they sang hymns with different lyrics. It was really during the heyday of what I call the anti-monopoly movement, roughly 1870s to World War I, that the American left began to really do what the left in Europe was doing and continues to do afterwards, which was to represent the sort of ordinary white working class Christian citizens. But that era ended in World War I, and it has not returned again, at least not for the radical left. So, that in many ways helps to perhaps give a more sober reflection on some of the cultural gains of the 1930s left and the 1960s left that I was outlining before. But the other thing, I'll end with this, and this again is sort of a truism for those who study social movements and politics, but just to put it out there, and this really relates, I think, to what's happening with Occupy America today, which is that I think in order to push forth progressive change in this country, you need two things at all times. You need, on the one hand, social movements, like the one that Occupy America, I hope, is going to become, the one that the New Left was, and the Black Freedom Movement was, and the labor movement of the 1930s was, with radicals very important in all of those movements. They need to push people in power. Frederick Douglass famously said, "Power yields nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." And that's, perhaps the truest thing that could be said about politics. At the same time, they need, of course, movements to put forth ideas about policy. They need to have sympathetic people in public office, or to get sympathetic people in public office. One of the demoralizing things I think about Barack Obama's administration for a lot of people was that people expected him to sort of be the change, even though he said, no, you're the change. And at least until very recently, maybe Occupy America will be this push. Until recently, whatever you think of what Obama should have done or could have done, and we can, of course, talk for hours and hours about this, in the key 2 years before the 2010 election, he didn't have the kind of left that Franklin Roosevelt had to push him, that Lyndon Johnson had to push him, that Abraham Lincoln had to push him, that the abolitionist movement, that Woodrow Wilson had to push him, Theodore Roosevelt had to push him, and so forth. So without this, group of visionaries, utopians, if you will, to the left of the president, presidents are not going to be the presidents that progressives like us would like them to be. So even though one can fault Obama in lots of ways, and I certainly would, the key absence, at least until now, has been the kind of left that I write about in this book, which in cultural ways and also as activists in social movements could push people where they really should go. And I look forward to hearing from Kelly and to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Hello. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for Michael. There's some interesting ideas there that we can talk further. My name is Kelly. I'm one of the occupiers at Liberty Plaza, which is what we call it, also known as Zuccotti Park. I didn't prepare anything for this discussion. I didn't actually know exactly what we were going to do here. I was invited here by my friend Richard Brodsky. So,
and it never will. And that's, perhaps the truest thing that could be said about politics. At the same time, they need, of course, movements to put forth ideas about policy. They need to have sympathetic people in public office, or to get sympathetic people in public office. One of the demoralizing things I think about Barack Obama's administration for a lot of people was that people expected him to sort of be the change, even though he said, no, you're the change. And at least until very recently, maybe Occupy America will be this push. Until recently, whatever you think of what Obama should have done or could have done, and we can, of course, talk for hours and hours about this, in the key 2 years before the 2010 election, he didn't have the kind of left that Franklin Roosevelt had to push him, that Lyndon Johnson had to push him, that Abraham Lincoln had to push him, that the abolitionist movement, that Woodrow Wilson had to push him, Theodore Roosevelt had to push him, and so forth. So without this, group of visionaries, utopians, if you will, to the left of the president, presidents are not going to be the presidents that progressives like us would like them to be. So even though one can fault Obama in lots of ways, and I certainly would, the key absence, at least until now, has been the kind of left that I write about in this book, which in cultural ways and also as activists in social movements could push people where they really should go. And I look forward to hearing from Kelly and to hearing your questions. Thank you.
hello. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for Michael. There's some interesting ideas there that we can talk further. My name is Kelly. I'm one of the occupiers at Liberty Plaza, which is what we call it, also known as Zuccotti Park. I didn't prepare anything for this discussion. I didn't actually know exactly what we were going to do here. I was invited here by my friend Richard Brodsky, so thanks to him for setting this up. But what I can do is give you a little overview of what this movement is about, how it started, and dispel some of the ideas that may be out there about it. And first of all, I just want to say that I am just one individual as part of this movement. I'm not an official spokesperson or anything like that. This is a leaderless movement. It's a true grassroots operation and grassroots movement of people who are spontaneously coming together, uniting under ideas such as the idea that we are the 99%, a percentage of the population who, as much as we would like to be participating in our government and having control over our lives, we are not that 1% at the very top that control banks and corporations and set the agendas that fund the politicians in government and the lobbyists that really truly set the agenda for our country. And this movement started as an idea that was put out in a magazine called Adbusters, which is an anti-corporate arts and culture magazine. They put out an ad that just advertised this idea of a protest that would happen, and it was put out there without too much instruction other than this is when it is and this is what's going to happen. And then this idea just sort of spontaneously grew through social media and through the internet. How many of you are on Facebook? Pretty much everyone. That's great. And Twitter? Anyone here on Twitter? So there you have it. That's how this movement started, was through the internet, and that's what makes this really a movement that is very novel and much different than anything we've really seen before. It's a grassroots movement where people are communicating directly, and what we're doing is having a conversation, and we're doing it in the only means we have. We are regular people who look like me, who look like all of you, and our voices, we've realized, have not been heard in the media, have not been addressed, and as a result, our politicians haven't really heard our voice or addressed our concerns because they're busy taking care of the people who fund them to put them in office, which are banks, corporations, lobbyists, and the elite at the very top. So this movement started as a way for us to have our voice heard, and through the only means that we have, which is our freedom of association, in our freedom of public assembly, our ability to communicate with each other online, and our freedom of speech. And so the movement took shape on September 17th with a gathering in Bowling Green, and the police had already been aware of this idea that we were going to march on Wall Street, and they were fully prepared. They had Wall Street barricaded, and so we took our march to the closest public park, which was Zuccotti Park, just a block or so away. And from there, we held small working group meetings to discuss what our next strategies would be. And we reported back to the General Assembly, which has become our provisional means of making decisions. It's basically our public forum and our governing body, so to speak. But what's occurring right now in that park, it's hard to think of historical precedents, although there are. I would compare it to like the Paris Commune, or maybe even further back to the Agora of the ancient Greek city-states, where the free people would gather to speak publicly, and whoever was the best orator would basically have what they wanted enacted. And that's pretty much what's happening. We have an open democratic process where anyone who wants to speak can speak, and we reach our decisions based on consensus. And if you've been looking at YouTube, the videos, you can see, or if you've been watching the live stream, you can see how this process works. We're not allowed to use any sound amplification, so we've improvised a method known as the people's microphone, in which the speaker will speak in short sentences and the crowd will repeat it so that the sound is amplified and everyone can hear it. And this is an interesting development in terms of our process, because it creates solidarity and a singleness of purpose, and it also it really sort of makes us well, it just brings the ideas of solidarity and working together in a very powerful, symbolic way. And I would say the movement now is up to 27 days. It's expanded beyond just being in Wall Street. It's now all over the country and all over the world. And on Saturday, we're going to have a global day of solidarity where 650 cities all over the world are participating in demonstrations similar to what we're doing. So through the power of information technology and the internet, this is a movement that has grown substantially in just a few weeks, and it's a discussion that's now being carried out all over the world. And the people in this movement, we're in solidarity with the Arab Spring demonstrations, Egypt, Tunisia, the European movements in Greece, Spain, and others. And it's truly a global awakening of the public's participation in the process. And I think one of the great innovations or steps, one of the things that's going to come out of this that will be a fundamental change will be that the people, this is a new era in terms of public participation. We have, with internet technology, we're more connected than ever, and we are able to spontaneously self-organize and create results for ourselves. And I don't think we're going to move back within the model of just having elected representatives handle concerns for us. I think the move forward is going to be more direct action, and we're going to want control over our own lives, and we'll be becoming more responsible for taking actions on our own behalf rather than waiting for elected representatives who are funded by people who aren't us, and we expect them to address our concerns. One of the big complaints that we have is that Congress, who is supposed to represent us, pretty much all of them are millionaires. There's nothing inherently wrong with millionaires, but if pretty much every single congressman, maybe a few who aren't, are millionaires, then their concerns and the people that they're working for are not, the people who 99% of us are. So with that, I'll just leave this open to discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
We don't really want to use the microphones, but I'm instructed to, so yes. We thought about using the people's mic, but so I do want to start off. All right, well, we're just going to go a little off script for a second. Who came up with the people's mic? And maybe Mike can tell us if there's any precedent for for the people's mic. I've never heard of anything like that before until you all started to organize, and it seems in some ways so obvious. I mean, it just might not have created amphitheaters if they'd known about the people's mic.
Right, well, it was something we improvised, but it does have precedent. I don't know the history of it completely. It comes out of the General Assembly model, which is what we're using. But I don't know historically where it comes from, but I imagine from left-wing movements of the past.
I don't know any precedents of it, but
Really just put you on the
but
spot.
well, yeah, but actually, until the 20th century, there was no amplified sound. So if you wanted to be a speaker, you had to be able to speak loudly. I wrote a book about a great American orator, William James Bryan, who could be heard without any amplification by 10,000 people. So you know, people on our side got to learn to speak up. But no, I think it's when Miles and I were in college, we didn't have any microphones. We had to speak loudly. So I'm not criticism of anybody. Obviously, most people aren't used to doing that, but I think it's a great, very democratic, participatory innovation.
So the place I really wanted to start, Michael, was really with your book. I mean, the idea behind this event was that Michael wrote this book, and all of a sudden it was covered in the New York Times, and he subsequently wrote a piece for the New York Times. And I thought one of the interesting things was the day before the Occupy Wall Street protests began, there was a piece called The Unacknowledged Victories of the American Left, which was a review of the book by Beverly Gage, and it says, "We might as well call it The American Left is Dead." That's the very first sentence. Subsequently, on the 17th, you all started your movement, and I don't think many of us knew much about it at the time. Almost a week later, Mike, you wrote a piece that basically said that it was alarming that, in fact, there was no sort of widespread movement. And on that exact day, I think, Kelly, you were maced and a few other people had already begun to participate. So in some ways, it's ironic that at the exact moment we were saying that there was no movement, this thing was happening. But I guess the question I have for you, Michael, is this a movement? I mean, is this historically how things have started? I mean, Kelly's already talked about some of the technological differences, but have we seen just these sort of spontaneous flares, or should we really just call this an event at this particular moment, and we'd have to see how long it lasted?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's I'm just sort of look at it from outside, though I certainly support what's going on. And in the defense of Professor Gage, and you know, her piece was probably written in July, and my piece was written in August. So, the one that came out in late September. You know, there's a long lead time here in print, at least. You know, I look at this, and I've written some about Occupy Wall Street. You know, I think it's in some ways there are precedents in the sense that there were very different kinds of beginnings of movements. Spontaneous strikes on railroads in the 1870s, for example, helped to lead to the beginning of this anti-monopoly movement I mentioned before. There were unemployed marches, but I think it's a great, very democratic, participatory innovation.
So the place I really wanted to start, Michael, was really with your book. I mean, the idea behind this event was that Michael wrote this book, and all of a sudden it was covered in the New York Times, and he subsequently wrote a piece for the New York Times. And I thought one of the interesting things was the day before the Occupy Wall Street protests began, there was a piece called The Unacknowledged Victories of the American Left, which was a review of the book by Beverly Gage, and it says, "We might as well call it The American Left is Dead." That's the very first sentence. Subsequently, on the 17th, you all started your movement, and I don't think many of us knew much about it at the time. Almost a week later, Mike, you wrote a piece that basically said that it was alarming that, in fact, there was no sort of widespread movement. And on that exact day, I think, Kelly, you were maced and a few other people had already begun to participate. So in some ways, it's ironic that at the exact moment we were saying that there was no movement, this thing was happening. But I guess the question I have for you, Michael, is this a movement? I mean, is this historically how things have started? I mean, Kelly's already talked about some of the technological differences, but have we seen just these sort of spontaneous flares, or should we really just call this an event at this particular moment, and we'd have to see how long it lasted?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's I'm just sort of look at it from outside, though I certainly support what's going on. And in the defense of Professor Gage, and, and you know, her piece was probably written in July, and my piece was written in August. So, the one that came out in late September. You know, there's a long lead time here in print, at least. You know, I look at this, and I've written some about Occupy Wall Street. You know, I think it's, in some ways, there are precedents in the sense that there were very different kinds of beginnings of movements. Spontaneous strikes on railroads in the 1870s, for example, helped to lead to the beginning of this anti-monopoly movement I mentioned before. There were unemployment marches and anti-foreclosure actions in the early 1930s, led by left-wing parties at the time, often socialists and communists, but people did them themselves, whether or not they had an organizer to help them. And you know, that's something else about history. Nothing, I mean, with all, you know, respect to Kelly, I don't think anything's really spontaneous in history. You know, everyone starts something. I mean, Adbusters had this idea. There's been, for, you know, 20, 30 years at least, progressives of various kinds have been making a lot of the same arguments about economic inequality, about the wage gap, about the tax system, and of course, more recently about the real estate bubble and who's responsible for that, now people are making on Wall Street and elsewhere. So you know, part of the problem of being a historian is that you don't think anything's really new. Everything comes from someplace, you know. So I think that's important. Whether this can become a much larger movement, well, I hope so. I think that it's clear, again, we can perhaps, you know, have some discussion about this. I think that what Kelly talked about, the process of this movement is very inspiring, and obviously it's helped it to grow to the point it has grown now, because if you had one leader saying, I want you to do this, then a lot of people would say, I don't think so. Whereas when people make the decisions themselves about what they're going to do in terms of the process of the demonstration, it's likely to grow more quickly. However, some of the things that Kelly said and some of the things I've read about Occupy Wall Street do remind me a little bit of the early days of SDS, the group that I was involved in. And we had a concept called participatory democracy, which people might have heard of. Hi, Joanne. And participatory democracy was a wonderful idea. We sort of thought we'd have lots of meetings all the time, we'd decide things by consensus. Our model was a New England town meeting, which was, you know, we're a little romantic about that too. But if you know anything about the history of the 60s, and many of you probably do, participatory democracy, you know, didn't last as a vision for all kinds of reasons. As the movement got bigger, it was impossible to keep deciding things by consensus. It was impossible to keep focusing on how people felt about the process and so forth. And also, you know, things happening in the world began to steer a lot of people like us to some very bad places, like thinking that you know, communism was okay if it was in the third world, as opposed to in Russia, for example. So I think that at some point, a kind of utopian process has to yield to the kind of thing I talked about a little bit in my remarks. That is, there has to be some coming to terms with people in power, I think. There has to be a way to realize that as large as demonstrations can be, and as much as this might continue to grow into the late fall, even the winter, at some point, you know, we aren't going to take power in this society. You know, we have to deal with people who are in power and push them to do what we want them to do, at least as much as we can. So I think that process is something which, again, sort of a truism of history, and at some point, this movement is going to be that. Is it yet a big movement? Well, the thing, finally, I've gone on too long here, but the thing I think that's most encouraging to me about what's going on is the process is wonderful, but it's that for the first time, really, in my lifetime, and perhaps the first time since the 1930s, since that last terrible economic calamity, people are all around America now are being urged to talk and being inspired to talk about economic inequality, are being inspired to talk about whether it's 99% or 98%, it doesn't really matter, but talking about who really runs the society, you know? We've had 20, 30 years of conservative dominance, conservative hegemony over these questions. The idea that big government is the terrible evil, you know, and the free market is just a wonderful thing and gives opportunity to everybody, you know. Finally, again, we can talk about why regulation matters, why labor unions are important, why people need to have democracy at the workplace, as well as voting for people once every couple of years. So for me, that's the most important thing about this, this movement.
Just have one demonstration and think that's going to solve anything. The only way we can do anything, solve any problems, is to make it a sustained, ongoing issue, and that's what we're doing. We have people who are committed to making this a long-term struggle, and so we've brought that back into the set of tools that we use to get our message out. And I think that's what makes this a movement, is that there's a deep commitment, and it'll last years if it needs to.
It was great. One thing that I wanted to pick up on that both of you talked about, and this really is a question to you, Kelly. One of the things that Michael's book really emphasizes is the idea that you have to dream, you have to be imaginative, and that was one of the key sort of kernels of left success as a whole, the radical left, and that sort of disappeared in the 1980s up until now. And I just so happen to be on your blog, which is Live Rent Free or Die. Is that right?
That's right.
Live Rent Free or Die. In New York, we all can appreciate that. And you said something that really struck a chord with me, which was, I feel like we're at the beginning of a new era of human history, which in so many ways to me mirrored a lot of the things that I heard radical socialists say, radical communists say. And I wanted to know, what did you sort of just said it in passing and kept writing, but I know this is your view and not necessarily the view of the movement, but what were you talking about? What was at the heart of that comment?
Well, there's a lot of things involved in that, but I think the most important thing that makes it a new era is that we're so deeply connected, and that the technology that we're using is bypassing the mainstream media. This movement utilizes we have a media center as part of our encampment where we're constantly live streaming. You can go on at any time and watch live what's happening. We're encouraged to always have our cameras ready in case the police enter, so that everything's documented. But it's just the fact that we are putting this out there into the world, and thousands of people are watching at any moment. We would not be as nearly successful as we are right now if it wasn't for the people who are following us in cyberspace. We get clothes, we get food, we get supplies donated to us from all over the world every day. So we in the encampment have become an organism. And we've formed a group mind, and we've put aside our differences from all of our backgrounds, and we've united in solidarity behind a common cause. But we also have supporters who are backing us from all over the world. So it's this new model that I think is emerging, and I think no matter what happens with the movement, I think this closeness and connection is going to continue in some really interesting ways.
Just something to follow up on, the idea of what exactly the composition of Occupy Wall Street is. So what types of people are down there? I mean, one of the criticisms that we hear from the right is that you're just a bunch of young hippies who are, there's all this free love stuff going on down there. You went down to hook up. Tell us something about like the actual quality of the people who were there. How is it that you all, I think you keep about 100 to 200 people in the park fairly regularly. So do these people have jobs? What do they do? Are they, I mean, I couldn't be down there every day unless Demos let me.
They should. Yeah.
Right. So what types of people are down there? Who are your friends down there?
Okay. Well, we have to take a look at what it was in the early beginning, in the first 10 days before. The first 10 days, people don't know anything about because the media wasn't there and didn't cover it. And this was when the early phase, when we started this movement, was the truly creative process where there was like 100 to 200 people who slept in the park, but we were working 24 hours a day. We were in groups, we were planning, strategizing, and trying to meet our immediate needs to turn the park into a sustainable village. And that was the most interesting part of this, but it was never covered. So people don't see what we were doing at that time. All they see is the influx of thousands of people who are now there, and some of whom don't represent us at all. And we do have an image problem right now because of the young drifter types who are there just to sleep all day, and the media takes their pictures and not the people who are organizing. And they also take pictures of young college kids who come down and think it's a vacation. But there's people who are in that camp that are working 15 hours a day, spreading the word and organizing and strategizing, and that's truly what the movement is. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and actually it leads me to a question I wanted to ask Michael. So, you know what the conservatives have been saying, David Brooks has called you milquetoast radicals and so forth, but you did have one supporter on the conservative side, George Will, who said that I wish the Occupy Wall Street folks long life and good health, because after 1968, there were after 4 years of protests, you had Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Bush. So Michael, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you pointed out the extent to which there had been this cultural change because of what the radical left had done. But it also, if George Will is right, I mean, he's not a historian, but it ushered in this massive period of conservatism in our history. And should we be wary of that? Is there something the Occupy Wall Street people need to know about the type of movement they're engaging in?
I feel uncomfortable being there as the older, advisor or something, but people have to make their own mistakes. We certainly made a lot more mistakes than these folks have so far made, believe me. We meaning new leftists like myself and Miles. Miles made fewer mistakes. Well, first of all, don't be violent. That's probably obvious, but the minute people on the left, progressives, whatever you want to call them, start saying, hey, we're going to fight back against the police, very bad idea. The part of what discredited the anti-globalization protest for a lot of people, I think, was the black dressed anarchists, who thought trashing Starbucks was a revolutionary action, and then of course couldn't wait to go to the next Starbucks and buy their latte. And I think that's obviously a no-no. But look, one of the things which is true about the left in this country and lefts anywhere is that they breed an anti-left. It's always true, and sometimes it's because of what they do that's their fault. Like the communists, for obvious reasons, bred a lot of anti-communists, of which the founders of the magazine I co-edit. Dissent were a very good, I think, honorable left-wing example of. But I think you have to be careful, clearly, to not make claims you can't back up. You have to be careful to give people different ways to get involved, and not make. And I think in many ways what's going on is doing that. That you can't make it seem as if either you do it our way or you're not really in the struggle, this kind of thing. So. Sectarianism, I mean, all these obvious problems are more problems for progressives, I think, because people in power are, of course, want to discredit you. As you know, Eric Cantor last week, the House Majority Leader, said that this is just a bunch of unruly mobs, and of course, he didn't mention the people in the Tea Party who were having, epithets of Obama as a monkey, a couple of years, last year. But I think that the struggle for the left in terms of image is always to appear both inspired and rational at the same time. And that's not always easy to do. But I think the more diverse the composition of folks, the more people can be very specific about their charges. I think that right now, as I said before, the consensus model works, but at some point, I think people will have to say, okay, these are really what our main grievances are, and this is really what our overall demands are, not into the fine weeds of policy. But generally, these four things should be fixed in this country. Wop, bop, bop, bop. And let George Will defend, a lower capital gains tax than an income tax, for example. You know, let conservatives do that kind of thing. David Brooks's column was, you know, typical David Brooks. I mean, it was, let's get all these policy wonks together that are all centrists, and they all solve the problems of the country. That's not how democracy works.